Well, you guys wanted this. So about 4 years ago, I made a list of the Season 2 death battles, ranking them from my least favorite to my favorite, and giving a little bit of commentary on each. It's since become my most popular video by a country mile with almost 7,500 views at the time of recording this. So naturally, you all wanted me to make a list on Season 3. While I initially did one for Season 3 with the podcast, some of you didn't watch that, and I'm not too happy with how that turned out. Plus, we've also had 3 seasons since then. So I figured I'd do a list for each of the seasons that have finished since Season 2, and I guess make a list for each season as an annual thing until the show's conclusion. And before you ask, no, I will not do a list like this for Season 1, as I think it would be unfair to judge those episodes by today's standards, since a lot of them are really old and suffer from early installment weirdness, so don't expect it to happen. With that said, let's finally get to the video you all came for. This is Wolf's Top 14 Season 3 Death Battle Episodes. If you want my opinion on Season 3 as a whole, I would say that you could describe it with 2 words. Wasted potential. This episode is an example of that. Okay, where do I start with this episode? No, really, this episode is such a train wreck that trying to find a place to start is like trying to figure out which Michael Bay Transformers movie you hate most. It's a pain in the ass to figure out, and you eventually reach the conclusion that it's Transformers 2. This episode had so many good things going for it when it was announced. 2 of Nintendo's highest profile villains in a fight against each other? Who could say no to that? Granted, I know plenty of people who would have wanted a massive army battle between Bowser, K. Rool, and DDD, but this was still a great fight idea. And then the episode itself happened. Now let me state this for the record. Ganondorf is my favorite villain in video games hands down. I don't care if people think he's overrated, I still think he's a badass and deserves his popularity, so I don't hate this episode because he won. Far from it. My first problem with this episode, I guess, should be the result itself, since that seems to be what most people in the community think matters most when it comes to the quality of an episode. While that isn't true at all, having a wrong verdict can make an already bad fight even worse than it was before, and yeah, this episode is just absolutely wrong, right down to Death Battle using a no limits fallacy to explain why Bowser lost. But I'm a big proponent of just because a fight is wrong doesn't mean it's bad, so there must be a lot more for it to be the worst of Season 3, and oh yes there is, dear viewers. First off, there's the sprites themselves. Bowser himself looks perfect, and Ganondorf at least looks decent enough for the fight. It's when he transforms into Ganon that everything goes horribly wrong. You have a sprite meant to be looked at from a top-down angle, fighting a sprite that's viewed from the side, and you're telling me these two mesh well together. They look awful against each other, and Ganon himself looks like he's doing a Michael Jackson lean the whole time. It's really awkward to look at. If that doesn't bother you, the animation itself will. I barely even remembered things that happened in this fight, and the stuff I do remember is remembered for the wrong reasons. There's a scene in the fight where Bowser uses a tennis racket to reflect Ganondorf's magic, kind of like you do in every Ganondorf fight in the Zelda series, and that could have been done amazingly, if the time between hits didn't make it seem like they were so far away that they both had plenty of time to react. There's only 2 things I can think of that I like about this episode. 1, the Star Wars prequel joke made in the Ganon section. Heck, even No Context Death Battle used it. And 2, Blood on Broken Glass, the fight song Brandon Yates made for this episode. Honestly, Brandon's done amazing work with almost every song he's done in Death Battle. A shame that such an amazing track was wasted on such a terrible episode. Now, if you want me to be honest, the bottom 2 episodes on this list are kind of interchangeable depending on one factor, and some of you might have been expecting this to be number 14.
Well, so much for the death in Death Battle now, right?
Another happy ending!
This episode enrages me, probably more than Yang vs. Tifa did. I think what enrages me about it is just the episode premise itself. Deadpool is probably the character that gets flanderized by people who don't write comics the most in fiction, especially by fans. Everyone just makes him seem like a fourth wall breaking serial killer. Deadpool is a far more developed character than that, honestly. And Pinkie Pie gets the same treatment, seeming like nothing more than a fourth wall shattering partier with a psycho side, when the fourth wall breaking only happened once in the show's history as far as I remember, as was her mental issues. Seriously, both characters are far more likable than people make them seem to be, so seeing these two get matched up against each other just angers me, more than it really should for something that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And these misinterpretations of these characters are reflected in the writing, especially the analysis part of the episode. I will give it credit that the animation for the fight was pretty good, up until the characters broke the fourth wall. Seriously, it looked like a good episode for maybe 30 seconds, and that's just shameful. Once they started going all over to different episodes, I just lost all hope in this one. So why is this higher than Bowser vs. Ganon? I think really it comes down to expectations. I went into Deadpool vs. Pinkie ready to hate it, and I was certainly given reason to, but with Bowser vs. Ganon, I expected so much more out of it. Which episode you dislike more really comes down to which you hate more between no hype throughout, or plenty of hype to start before it takes a plummet into the ground. For me, the latter is more often worse, so that's why Bowser vs. Ganon gets the bottom spot, while this is only one spot ahead of it. Such a shame, honestly. Time for the obligatory boring episode of the season.
Not as tough as you look.
Finish her!
I've got this son of a bitch. Always gotta be the hard way.
This episode was just bland and felt worthless. Like, nothing in this episode felt interesting in the slightest. I can't even say it's a matchup with a character I either like or hate, because I find most of the Street Fighter cast to be just dull, and I find the normal characters in Mortal Kombat to not really be that interesting. At least it feels like it's a short episode, so it doesn't stick around for way past what it needs to. This one's a bit personal to me. I feel like I should explain why.
Not this time, Yankee!
Oh, come on, give me a...
Well, that was fun.
Okay, so those of you who did see the list when I was a part of the podcast know that this was the section I requested not be added into the final version. The reason why this is the case is because, well, personal reasons. Let's just say that it turned from discussing the episode into arguing about it and leave it at that. I don't really hate this episode per se, but it does still make me uncomfortable watching it for private reasons. The animation is pretty good, though I think it would have been better if it was animated in Source Filmmaker, because Scout kinda looks odd in this episode. Not terrible, just odd. The voice acting for both Tracer and Scout is pretty spot on, and Nathan Vetterlane, the official voice actor for Scout in Team Fortress 2, was willing to put in his voice talents once he heard of this fight's existence, though by then the episode was already in post-production. But Alex Gross still did pretty good sounding like him, even if there's some obvious differences if you hear the two simultaneously. Elsie Lovelock, on the other hand, was perfect at Tracer, and sounded so much like Cara Theobald that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between the two. The animation was pretty well put together, and it's a nice episode with some things I could nitpick about it if I wanted to, but for very personal and private reasons, I don't feel comfortable putting it any higher, and I don't really want to talk about it anymore. I'm just gonna move past it since this episode's already given me enough trouble as it is. Funny how the order of these last three was in the order of which the episodes got released. I did not plan that at all.
You're dead! Okay!
Also, oddly enough, despite being 10 out of 14 in terms of ranking, this is probably the most meh episode Death Battle did in Season 3 and one of the most meh episodes in the series. I mean, the research was good and some of the jokes were funny, but there were plenty of unfunny jokes and the animation left a lot to be desired. It's just there. Nothing I can really say about this one other than it exists. There's only one word to describe this episode. Well, that or lackluster.
Maria. Wait, where am I? Oh my god, I'm glowing! Why am I glowing? Sayonara.
Okay, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way first. Yes, the voice acting has several problems, and Taka was told to sound bad on purpose. Truth be told, I actually liked his performance as Shadow against Vegeta, and he's a really good voice actor, but this, no. I know Ben told Taka to make Shadow sound intentionally bad to reference the bad voice acting of Sonic Adventure 2, though there were some parts where you could hear Taka at least tried to make a good performance, but stylistic suck is difficult to pull off, and it does not work here. And it's not like Kerbifer did too well of a job as Mewtwo either, though it was at least better than Taka's performance. The animation is okay, I guess. It's pretty serviceable, especially with the killing blow, though there are some really bad parts at times, like with Mewtwo being in the shadows before the fight started. Seriously, look at him! He somehow looks even more anorexic than he already did. Jokes were decent. Seriously, everything here was okay at best, with one notable exception that lifted this fight up higher: the music. Seriously, the music of Brandon Yates is fantastic, and you should go check out his original works after this video is done, because it is amazing. This isn't a sponsor or anything, I just really like his work. Quite honestly, I think this fight gets a bit too much hate. Like, people seem to dislike this solely because Amy not only appeared in it, but also won. I understand that the Sonic franchise can be a bit behind on the times and the fanbase can be a bit much, but I think that's a stupid reason to hate this episode just for having a Sonic character in it. I think this episode's actually pretty good. The animation was pretty decent, especially with the fight going to the subspace suitcase. I suppose the most logical reason I've heard for this episode being bad is that the result was wrong or inaccurate, but not only would I not know, I've said before that accuracy isn't as major of a problem as people make it seem. That's not to say this episode is flawless, as it doesn't really have much hype, and both characters have opponents who could be considered better matchups, but it does deserve more positive attention than what it gets. This one, on the other hand, I can see legitimate reasons why it gets so much hate.
Hey, so I know you're about to pummel her ginger face in and all, but you also only talk in grunts, so I'm just gonna say this one line for you, okay? Just this one time. Oh! Son of a bitch!
KO!
Church,
Yeah?
no action movies.
Don't get me wrong, I like this episode, and it's a better episode than Amy vs. Ramona, but there are some legit problems that hold it back. For good things, though, the voice acting is spot on, and I do think the interactions between the Blood Gulch crew and our favorite mentally unstable hosts are great. The fight's a good little addition to Season 14 of Red vs. Blue, which makes this a weird episode, but also a very nice crossover between the two shows. But there are things wrong with it, as I said. As much as I love seeing Wiz and Boomstick interacting with the RVB cast, especially Boomstick beating up on Griff, the constant cutting away can get rather irritating and it screws with the structure of the episode. It's also an example of why does this exist at all, but unlike something like Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie, this at least turned out to be not terrible. The big problem, however, is what happened before the fight. Ben made a post on the old forums talking about how he was happy to do an episode for Red vs. Blue, but it didn't quite come off like that. The way it was typed out, it almost made Ben sound like he was complaining about how Death Battle was being run, and almost blaming the fans and that they should be happy for him to be able to do this episode. From the people I've spoken to, Ben is one of the nicest guys on the internet. He doesn't really toot his own horn much, and he's actually really friendly, but he has trouble articulating what he means when he types things out. From what I've gathered, Ben was feeling a little stressed out due to the changes being made at Screw Attack at the time, as well as things going on in his personal life, so that combined with people on the forums asking, why are they doing this episode? Could have also played a part in his reaction. Could he explain things a little better? Certainly, but I'm sure he didn't mean any sort of ill will toward anyone in particular. It's a flawed episode, but still good nonetheless. A lot of the things in this episode should have been seen from a mile away. Even the matchup itself.
This is the source of my power. And here, I am king! Ew. Well, at least you beat me here. Huh. Bye!
Predictability is a bit of an odd thing to have with episodes. A predictable outcome of a match can sometimes take the fun out of an episode. But if you don't give a predictable outcome, it can lead to people getting angry. This one was probably one of the most obvious stomps in the show's history, what with how much faster Flash is compared to, well, a lot of speedsters actually. Flash for the longest time was a lot like Aquaman in my opinion. Everyone that wasn't in nerd culture, and even some that were, thought that Flash was pretty much useless. And when you've got a guy like Superman on the same team as you, it's not hard to see why. But as a result, Flash still gets plenty of hate to this day. Or at the very least, Barry Allen does for being boring. The CW show does seem to have helped him out quite a lot, however, so that's at least something. But how a character appears and how capable they actually are can be two different things, and knowing even the basics of Barry's powers should have told you how much he destroys Quicksilver. But anyway, predictability, much like the result of a fight, doesn't necessarily make a bad episode. This is one example. There were some good moments here, like the stuff with Flash dragging himself and Pietro into the Speed Force, and the randomness of Craig being surprisingly good at voicing Captain America. The jokes were okay, I guess. I mean, the ones making fun of the absolute fustercluck that is Marvel's canon backstory for Quicksilver is pretty good, but for every joke like that, we have stuff like Boomstick trying and failing to sound like Freddie Mercury, who he most certainly is not. The animation was okay in some spots, but it ironically felt too slow for a fight between two speedsters. Edwin Tiong was pretty good as Quicksilver, but Anthony Bowling was meh as Flash. At times he sounded way too nerdy, but then he sounds freaking awesome at other times, and it's just really confusing and inconsistent. But yeah, that moment in the Speed Force easily makes this one of the better fights in the season, just not top 5 material. I would have just had this section start off with an imitation of one of Joker's laughs, but then I realized that was a dumb idea.
Die.
The rest of the episodes, starting with this one, are all great episodes. Not excellent, but still ones I'll happily go back and rewatch whenever. That being said, there are issues with this fight I'll get into later. First off, this episode has really good animation. The fight looks amazing, and credit to Torian for making such a great fight happen, especially making the Sweet Tooth itself pretty much from scratch. The voice acting from both Lucas Schuneman and Gianni Matragano are fantastic, both sounding different enough from other voices of the characters they're playing to make them notable, but still similar enough that they're in character, or at least it feels like it. And the jokes are pretty spot on, getting quite a few good laughs as clowns should make you do. There are still a few things, however, that hold this episode back. For one, I feel like the fight was a bit too long, a few moments seeming like they either should have been shortened or just cut out entirely. And then there's the fact that the music wasn't really that great, it was just sort of there. but the big thing for me was the fact that the animation was a bad representation of how Joker could win. I know that the animation isn't exactly how the fight would play out, but it's supposed to be a culmination of all their research, and if that's the case, it's not exactly present here. There's several times when Joker obviously should have died throughout the fight animation itself, according to the evidence Death Battle showed, and it's pretty obvious if you think about some of them for even a minute or two. Still, this episode was fun and high quality. Definitely worthy of being called a good episode. New from Insomniac, The Breakdancing Rhino 5, on sale now.
And curtain.
Originally, I'd put this episode as my personal favorite episode of Season 3, but obviously it's dropped since then. But hey, the episode's still great. The jokes they made were very funny, and the rest of the writing is very well done. The animation was amazing, though there were some rather odd moments in it, like the rather basic looking effect for the Green Eco. The choreography in the fight is well put together for all four, and Ratchet and Clank really show why they were such a well-united team, which helped them to win. The items that were used in the fight were used very effectively, and they used quite a decent number for characters that both have such varied attacks at their disposal. The Rhino 5 in particular was hilariously used and definitely the most memorable part of the episode. My biggest issue here is the voice acting. Jack sounds perfectly fine, and Ratchet sounds decent for someone who has to play a character with such a unique voice as James Arnold Taylor's, but Clank sounds a bit off enough for it to be distracting. And Daxter...
Make yourself comfortable on the couch, if you can find what's left of it!
No. They all look fine, the way they sound is the problem. Still, it's a relatively minor problem for such a great episode. Regardless of what you think about how Death Battle's been since the merger, you have to admit that this was an amazing episode.
Not possible.
Bullseye.
How come I never meet any nice girls?
In what might be the biggest project that Torian ever worked on in his run with the show, this is one episode I absolutely approve of. While there are some odd moments, it all blended together really well and looked absolutely fantastic. The voice acting was amazing, with Marissa Lenti's Bayonetta and Stephen Fu's Dante sounding pretty much perfect for their characters' official voices. It is one of the most well put together episodes of the show, even if you can call the accuracy of it into question. There are also some really badass moments in this episode in particular, like the 4-person battle where Sean and Trish join in on the fight, or the moment where the two both start to use their time-slowing effects. It really is an amazing episode, and I absolutely loved watching it. The only reason this gets the bronze medal is because A, the fight got spoiled for me before I saw it, and B, the next two episodes are just better. Still, third place is not a bad position to be in at all, just not quite enough to hit the jackpot. You know, from 2015 to about late 2017, it always seemed like 2D fights were considered overall inferior to 3D fights. Which I don't think is true, because if you look at both this list and my Season 2 list, the 2D fights could not only match the 3D fights, but surpass them at times. That being said, my favorite fights for Seasons 1 and 2 were both 3D fights, and it seems like Season 3 will be the same.
Now, where the hell is that shipyard?
Truth be told, I'm not really someone who watches anime that much, never mind reading manga. Frankly, I'm more of a video game guy, as you've probably seen. but I've had some familiarity with these two, and I think this was a pretty damn awesome showing for both of them. This episode is pretty close to perfect when it comes to death battle episodes. The writing was amazing, with both characters being written fantastically, and with plenty of good jokes from Wiz and Boomstick. The episode's animation is fantastic, both with the way of switching Erza into different armors, and with the way of making Zoro look like a frickin' crazy badass wielding 3 swords at once. Seriously, Erza's corpse is probably the bloodiest and goriest the show has had, and I mean that in a good way, because whoever made the detail that high did an amazing job. And this is coming from someone who doesn't like gore. I really do think this is an amazing job, and it's almost the best 2D animation the show's done. Almost. And it's not quite good enough to make it to the #1 spot. Speaking of... honestly, Season 3 is a disappointment for me. While I did enjoy some parts of it, a lot of the episodes aren't nearly as exciting as they should have been. Or, in some cases, if I did get excited for them, they didn't live up to the excitement. I suppose it was growing pains dealing with the Rooster Teeth merger, but I didn't have as much fun with Season 3 as I did with Season 2, or even Season 1. But quite honestly, I don't see how #1 could be anything else other than the greatest battle of anger to ever be put on the internet. Sweet, merciful, whatever deity it is you might be offended by if I use their name in vain, this episode was fantastic. 2016, even 4 years later, is one of the worst, most rage-inducing years I have ever felt. So having two massive beings of pure anger battle each other, especially with the day it came out on the Rooster Teeth website, probably summarized how a lot of people felt that year. And boy, does it deliver even now. The jokes are pretty damn amazing, even if the best ones were revealed in the previews of the episode. The writing overall was amazing, and the dialogue for Hulk in the fight was very fitting, and could get pretty funny at times. Parker being the voice for Hulk was just perfect, and he only made the animation even better. The music they included almost sounded like it was meant for this fight, even if they came from franchises that were pretty far from comic books. The feel of this battle just gets me pumped, and seeing badass moments like Hulk using a police car as boxing gloves, or the destruction of the building the two fought in, makes you understand why this fight was delayed. It actually came close to completely destroying Torian's computer just to make it. If a fight can do that, and still be a badass episode on its own, I think it more than it deserves to be #1. And to think, I've still got 3 lists to make for you guys after this. So I'll see you all next week with the Season 4 video.